This show is produced by the Harwood Podcast Network.
Hi, I'm Cindy Harris, and we love making this show available to you free of charge. If you'd like to help us keep it that way, make a contribution to our Karma Jar. For more information, visit our website. Today I've baked a batch of my glazed cinnamon muffins. If you're ever looking for a showstopper muffin, this could be it. It's got great muffin flavor, plus a cinnamon filling, a streusel top, and a wonderful glaze on top. And I'll even show you how to make these cute little parchment liners. We're going to begin by getting our muffin pan ready, and I have a 12-cup muffin pan. But instead of putting in the traditional paper liners like I usually do, I want to show you something that I think is kind of fun. I've taken some of my parchment paper and I've cut it into some 6-inch squares. And I'm going to take a piece and I'm going to center it over the hole of the muffin pan, and I'm going to take a drinking glass that can press right into the center all the way down to the bottom. I'm going to kind of wiggle this around. And then with my hands, I'm going to kind of crease the paper up the sides, and I'm going to use these as the liners for my muffins. And once you have them all placed, take your drinking glass again and just kind of make a little circle in the center, and that will kind of set the liners in your pan. And that's all we're going to do with the pan. I'm going to set this aside. Now these muffins have a topping, a filling, a batter, and a glaze, so that's what makes them so spectacular. We're going to start by making the topping. So I have a medium-sized bowl. I'm going to start with some brown sugar, and I'm going to measure out 1/3 cup, and it is important that you pack that sugar into the cup. And then we'll put that in our bowl. And then 1/4 cup of some chopped walnuts, 1/4 cup of some oats, and 1/2 cup of flour. And I'm going to take my little whisk and I'm going to whisk those ingredients together. I want to make sure that the brown sugar is broken up and mixed thoroughly in with that flour. Now I have 3 tablespoons of butter, and with my pastry blender I'm going to cut that in. And when the butter gets too collected, I'll just push it off with my hands. And then once the butter is cut in pretty well, I'm going to set the pastry blender aside, and with my hands I'm just going to grab the butter and that dry ingredients. I'm going to squeeze it together. And I'm making sort of some large clumps of streusel this way. Now you should feel butter pretty much throughout the dry ingredients, but it's not going to look wet. Sometimes, you know, when we make a streusel, it looks like wet sand. This is not going to look like that. This is going to look more like a large crumb. So it'll end up looking like this, and now we'll set that aside. And now we're going to make the filling part. So for that, I want to get my brown sugar out again. I'm going to start with 1/2 cup. Again, we want to make sure we pack it into our measuring cup. I'm going to put this in a little bit smaller bowl, along with a tablespoon of cinnamon. And with a spoon, I'm going to mix that brown sugar and cinnamon together. And once that's pretty well mixed together, I have 3 tablespoons of butter that I've melted. I'm going to add that and mix that in really well. Now you can see how this does look more like wet sand. It's nice and dark, full of cinnamon flavor. So that's good, and I'm going to set that to the side. And now it's time to make our batter. So I have a medium-sized bowl. I'm going to begin by measuring out 1 3/4 cup of flour. And to that, I'll add 1/2 cup of my oats, 3/4 of a cup of white sugar, a tablespoon of baking powder, and do make sure your baking powder is fresh. If it's not, these won't puff up. They'll be more dense and heavy, and that's not what we want. And then 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And again, with my whisk, I'm going to whisk all those ingredients together. What's really important with this is that we get that baking powder incorporated with all those other dry ingredients. And now I have 1/2 cup of butter that I've melted. I'm going to add that. 3/4 cup of milk, and I'm just using a 1% milk, but you could use whatever you have on hand. You'll see with my spatula, I'm just sort of stirring that in just a little bit. And then I'm adding in 2 eggs. And with my spatula, I'm going to kind of break those eggs up a little, and then I'm going to stir this all together. Now what I'm looking for here is a couple things. One, I want to make sure that that egg is mixed in. And 2, I want to make sure I don't see any of the dry ingredients. Sometimes little pockets of that can sneak by you. And then once that comes together, we're done. Now we're going to fill our liners. We're going to start with our batter, but we only want to use half the batter to start with. So what I do is I just take my spatula and I draw sort of an imaginary line down the middle, and I'm going to use my medium-sized cookie scoop, and I'm going to begin by dropping 1 scoop of batter into each of our liners. Now with a knife or a spoon, I'm just going to carefully move that batter so that it lines the bottom of our well thoroughly. Sometimes when you use the cookie scoop, it kind of keeps it in a lump in the middle, and I do want to move that out so that it's totally covering the bottom. Now we're going to put on our filling, and as you can see, the filling has really gotten nice and sturdy. So I'm just going to take a little pinch of it and sprinkle that on top of our batter. Again, we want to divide this up fairly evenly. So now they're kind of looking like this, and now we're going to go back and add the rest of the batter on top. So again, I'm just going to take my scoop and put a scoop on top of each. So I'm not going to bother moving the batter on top out because it will cover nicely, but it is time to put our topping on. So again, I'm just going to take little handfuls of this and sprinkle it on the top. And you can be pretty generous with the topping here. Now as you get towards the bottom, do grab the flour and the butter together so that you can get those crumbs. Now you can see that these fill up these liners beautifully. Well, it's time to bake them, so make sure your oven has been preheating at 400 degrees. Make sure that the shelf is low enough so that the little parchment is not too close to the top element. And then these are going to bake for about 20 minutes. Now while the muffins are baking, I'm going to go ahead and make my glaze. So in a small bowl, I have 2 tablespoons of cream cheese. And to that, I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of buttermilk. Now, if you can't get buttermilk where you live, remember you can easily make it by taking a 1-cup measuring cup, putting in a tablespoon of either lemon juice or vinegar, and then filling the cup up with milk, and then letting it sit for about 5 minutes. Now with a fork, I'm going to take and I'm going to sort of mash together that buttermilk and the cream cheese. Now at the beginning it's going to look like it's not going to go together, but if you just keep working with it, it will. So you can see the cream cheese and the buttermilks, you can't really tell the difference between the two anymore. Then I'm going to switch from my fork to my whisk, and I'm going to kind of whisk it up a little bit. And then I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And then I have a cup of powdered sugar, and I'm going to add that just a little bit at a time and whisk it in, and then add a little bit more, and then I'll finish up. And then I'm going to take my whisk and I'm going to really mix that together. And you'll find that most of the lumps come out just fine. Now you can see they come out nice and browned on the top. We do want to take a toothpick and stick it into one of them. We want to make sure that it comes out clear, that there's no creaminess on there, that they've baked through. And I'm going to let this sit here for about 5 minutes on a cooling rack. Now after the 5 minutes, I want to get these out of the pan. So I've got my cooling rack, and then I'm just going to carefully lift them by the parchment and place them here on the rack. And you can see how great they hold their shape with these little parchment liners we made. Now it's time to glaze. So I just use my whisk when I do this, but you could use a spoon if you'd like. And I'm just going to drizzle that right on top of each of the muffins. Now you can see as I drizzle it, I don't want to completely cover the muffin. I want to see that streusel on top. Now I like to let these cool to about room temperature because I find that you get more of the really rich flavors. If they're too warm, it kind of masks it a little bit. But I did want to show you what these look like. You see that parchment peels off lovely. And you can see not only the glaze, but that great filling in the center. Now if you'd like to try these glazed cinnamon muffins at home, just go to our website, go to the Nothing But Muffins show notes, and I'll have the recipe there for you. If you do make them, don't forget to send me a photo so I can send you the muffin badge. Please join us on Facebook, and as always, if you have any questions or ideas for me, please send me an email. I'll see you next time.